There are more than 371,000 miles of roads in America's national forests. To put this into perspective, the entire interstate highway system is just 46,876 miles, meaning there is roughly 8 times more road mileage in our national forests than spread out across the entire country's interstates. Of course, the fact that our national forests have roads in them isn't exactly surprising. National forests are managed for multiple uses, meaning industrial activity, such as logging and mining, are allowed on them. These roads facilitate that activity. These roads are the syringe by which we inject industrial development into the landscape and extract natural resources. They also facilitate recreational access, of course. But with this immense, sprawling network of roads comes certain challenges, both ecological and economic. Roads fragment habitat. They threaten endangered plants and animals. They're a vector for invasive species. They facilitate clear cuts and open pit mines. They destabilize slopes and introduce polluted runoff into pristine watersheds. Watersheds which protect the drinking water for an estimated 180 million people. And these roads are expensive. According to the United States Forest Service, the current maintenance backlog on its road network stands at $8.4 billion. For these reasons, because of all the negative impacts associated with road building, some areas of our national forests, in fact, do not have roads at all. They have deliberately and purposefully been excluded from road development in order to protect their ecological integrity, their drinking water resources, and their wilderness character. These roadless areas are the subject of this video. Today, we're taking a dive into the history, management, controversies, and misconceptions around roadless area management on the national forests of the United States. Now, broadly speaking, this video is about the Roadless Area Conservation Rule, which you may have heard of, otherwise just called the Roadless Rule, which was created in 2001 and is the main administrative mechanism by which the United States Forest Service manages roadless areas today. But to understand the Roadless Rule as it exists today, you really have to understand the full history of roadless area management in the United States, which actually goes back over 100 years. In 1924, the Forest Service began managing what it called wilderness areas, which are not the same as wilderness areas we have today. More on that later. These wilderness areas were created at the level of the individual national forests and put some basic restrictions on road building, timber harvesting, and summer home building, apparently. Then, in the 1930s, the Forest Service initiated a more nationwide application of roadless area management that would apply to all national forests with its so-called L regulations, which created what the Forest Service called primitive areas this time. These primitive areas, like the wilderness areas before them, placed certain restrictions on road building, permanent construction, timber extraction, and special use occupancy permits. Very similar to before, but again, this was a nationwide management policy this time. And by 1939, the Forest Service had designated more than 14 million acres of these primitive areas. Then, in 1939, the L regulations were replaced with the U regulations, which created 2 new classifications of roadless area: wild areas and wilderness areas. Different language, but again, broadly speaking, these designations precluded road development and timber harvesting, just like before. But here's the thing. These were administrative actions, meaning they were taken at the discretion of the Secretary of Agriculture or of the Chief of the Forest Service via the authority granted to them by the President of the United States. Administrative actions, as we have seen in recent years, can be reversed if a subsequent administration decides it does not like the actions of a previous administration. Meaning, roadless area management up to this point was really just at the whims of whoever was in the Oval Office. So, proponents of roadless area management, like Howard Sonnheiser, Bob Marshall, and Otto Leopold, began advocating for a more permanent legislative solution. They wanted a national law passed by Congress to formalize and strengthen roadless area management. They got that law on September 3rd, 1964, with the passage of the Wilderness Act. This law established the national wilderness preservation system we have today and immediately, right out of the gate, created 9.1 million acres of federally designated capital W wilderness, based in part on the Forest Service's previously designated primitive/wild/wilderness areas that we talked about earlier. Essentially, they just took those lands that the Forest Service had already identified as having wilderness characteristics and just formalized them with this new, stronger legal definition. Today, the wilderness designation is the strongest level of conservation protection available to a piece of federal public land in the United States. Wilderness areas are not allowed to have roads, any sort of commercial activity, or any sort of motorized transport. The act famously says that wilderness areas are to be places where, quote unquote, man is a visitor who does not remain. Today, we have almost 112 million acres of wilderness in the United States. But back in 1964, when the act was passed, besides those initial 9.1 million acres, the law also included a mechanism by which more wilderness could be added to the National Wilderness Preservation System. It called on the Secretary of Agriculture to essentially survey and inventory its remaining roadless areas, those not included in the initial legislation, for possible future designation as wilderness. The Secretary would then recommend those lands to the President, who would then turn around and recommend those lands to Congress for inclusion in the National Wilderness Preservation System. So the Forest Service did just that. They conducted what they called a Roadless Area Review and Evaluation, or RARE. There were two of these, RARE 1 and RARE 2. RARE 1 identified about 12 million acres as possible wilderness, and RARE 2 identified about 15 million acres. And here is where things start to get messy. See, neither RARE 1 or RARE 2 ever ended up getting recommended to Congress as wilderness. There were lawsuits, and the judges ruled that the Forest Service did not adequately follow the NEPA procedures, and therefore their reviews were invalid. The whole wilderness recommendation thing kind of just stalled out at this point and just kind of drug on and on and on, honestly, until Congress, rather than passing a single national bill that would have been recommended by the rare inventories, they simply just passed a series of state-specific wilderness bills instead. They did include some of the lands that the rare inventories had identified, but then other pieces of land, they simply said that you need to go back and study those and see what their wilderness characteristics actually are. And then some other pieces of land still, they said should just be managed at like a forest-specific level like they used to be back in the 20s. Essentially, they just punted on the issue, leaving a hodgepodge of roadless areas in management limbo. It was clear that these lands were not going to be included in the National Wilderness Preservation System and afforded the legal protections that entailed, but there was now the question of should these lands be managed under a national rule, as the Forest Service had been doing since the 1930s, or whether they should be left to local forest-specific management like the first ever wilderness areas that the Forest Service had devised in 1924. This whole fiasco is how we ended up with the 2001 Roadless Rule, the one we have today. And if you thought it was messy before, boy, just you wait. Essentially, the 2001 Roadless Rule was the Forest Service's attempt to relaunch roadless area management at a national level following the Rare 1 and 2 fiascos. Basically, the Forest Service did what they had been doing for several decades up to this point. They inventoried a bunch of their land for roadless characteristics, categorized it into what they called inventoried roadless areas, or IRAs, and began managing those lands to maintain their roadless character. This was basically the LNU regulations all over again. Same basic management principles, managing lands for roadless characteristics. The Roadless Rule itself is really quite simple, at least for the purposes of this video and what you need to know to broadly understand the rule. Broadly speaking, the 2001 Roadless Rule does three things: prohibits road construction, prohibits road reconstruction, and prohibits timber harvesting, with several exceptions, which we'll talk about later. The Forest Service laid out three main justifications for enacting this new roadless area policy. Number one, to protect the remaining unfragmented/undeveloped parts of the National Forest System. Number two, to cut down on road maintenance and construction costs. And number three, to cut down on litigation costs related to roadless area management because they were getting sued a lot at this time. The Roadless Rule, however, did not go over well. Almost as soon as the rule was officially implemented, it was challenged in court. And also the new Bush administration created its own rule in 2005, which it dubbed the State Choice Rule, that allowed individual states to submit basically their own rules. All of this became a mess. There were overlapping lawsuits, mass administrative confusion. At one point, legally speaking, because of certain court decisions, both the 2001 Clinton rule and the 2005 Bush rule were in effect at the same time. It was really messy, and I won't bore you with all the details here. We'll just skip to the end, to 2011, when everything finally made its way through the courts, who ruled that the 2001 Roadless Rule was in effect nationwide. But not for Colorado and Idaho, actually, because they did get their own state-specific rules through some administrative nonsense. And anyway, we're not going to talk about those. We don't have time for it. But yeah, that's how it stands today. 2001 Roadless Rule applies in 48 states. Colorado and Idaho have their own rule. As of today, there are currently about 58 million acres of land covered by the Roadless Rule in the United States, about 30% of the entire national forest system. Alaska's Tongass and Chugach National Forests alone have almost 15 million acres of inventoried roadless areas, the most of any state. And broadly speaking, guys, the Roadless Rule is very popular with the public. At the time it was created in 2001, the public comment process generated over 1 million comments, the vast majority of which were in favor of the rule. But of course, as we have seen, the political process surrounding roadless area management, at least since the 1970s, has been highly controversial and contentious, with numerous lawsuits and administrative actions trying to get the Roadless Rule rescinded. Speaking of which, you often see the same talking points and misconceptions thrown around when trying to justify getting rid of the Roadless Rule. So I want to use this next segment of the video to dispel some of those talking points, give you the proper information about the benefits the Roadless Rule actually provides, and hopefully give you the tools you need to dispel this misinformation if you see it online or in real life. Misconception number 1. The Roadless Rule is overly restrictive, and getting rid of it will open up areas of high-value timber. The reason this is a misconception is because roadless areas are often roadless for a reason. The reason we never built roads in them in the first place is because they are in extremely remote, rugged locations that are very hard to access, like a very steep slope, for instance, which means they actually contain lower quality timber, and or extracting timber from those areas would not make economic sense. Misconception number 2, that managing forests through logging is healthier for them than allowing them to remain roadless. This is what we led the video off with. We know through numerous studies and analyses that roads fragment habitat, imperil endangered species, introduce pollutants and runoff into watersheds that provide drinking water for 180 million people, and silt up rivers that provide subsistence fishing opportunities for anglers and indigenous tribes. Logging these forests would also release tremendous amounts of carbon that has been stored in them for millennia. The Tongass National Forest in Alaska alone stores 44% of the carbon for the entire national forest system. Misconception number 3, the Roadless Rule restricts economic development. While it is true that the Roadless Rule restricts logging, which of course restricts the amount of money to be made from logging and the jobs the logging industry provides, logging is only one piece of the economic development puzzle. In reality, according to a study out of Colorado State, roadless areas, which include both wilderness areas and Roadless Rule areas, provide over $2 billion in economic benefits between recreation, passive use, environmental services, and carbon sequestration. They also support more than 24,000 jobs. And that study doesn't even include Alaska, whose multi-billion-dollar fisheries industry relies on the clean water that roadless area watersheds provide. So we already talked about the maintenance backlog of the existing Forest Service road network stands at over $8.4 billion. Carving roads into 58 million more acres of national forest is only going to balloon maintenance costs at a time when Forest Service budgets and staff are actively shrinking. Misconception number 4, the Roadless Rule prevents firefighters from accessing important areas to fight wildfires. In fact, the Forest Service's own data shows that 85% of wildfires are caused by humans, and 90% start within 1 mile of a road. Also, the Roadless Rule explicitly includes exceptions for road building related to fighting wildfires. And finally, misconception number 5. The Roadless Rule is just a way of bypassing the Wilderness Act and creating wilderness without legislative approval. The Roadless Rule is nowhere near as restrictive as what you'll find in wilderness areas. The Roadless Rule specifically allows road building in the case of emergencies, again, like wildfires, something that is not allowed in the Wilderness Act. The roadless rule also still allows motorized vehicle access, commercial activity, mining, energy development, and certain forest management activities, all of which are not allowed in wilderness areas. The roadless rule is a more restrictive classification of land use, yes, that's the whole point, but it is not a replacement for wilderness. Okay, with all that being said, this is the part of the video where I need your help. If you've been around my channel long enough, you know that I make videos like this every so often, usually when something is happening that I feel you need to be informed about, and that requires action. This video is no exception. I've made my case for why the roadless rule is important, and now I need you to help protect it. Currently, the United States Forest Service has announced that they have formally begun the process of rescinding the roadless rule, meaning 30% of our national forests will be opened up to dangerous extractive activity, harming our forests, the ecosystems that they're a part of, and the drinking water that many Americans rely on. Rescinding this rule would destroy over a century's worth of long-held, well-established roadless area management which is broadly popular, cost-effective, and successful. That's the bad news. The good news is they are required by law to accept our comments on this proposal, our feedback. Remember that when this rule was created, over 1 million people commented on it, most of them in favor of the rule. As of the time I'm recording this, over 78,000 people have already left their feedback for the Forest Service. Again, most of them in favor of the rule. And again, this is on an abbreviated timeline for public comment. We only got like 21 days to do this. What I need from you is to add to that tally. Tell the Forest Service you support the roadless rule and you oppose rescinding it. Now, how you do this is actually very important. Unlike other calls to action I've highlighted in the past, there is no autofill, autosend, fill out a template option here. This is a formal government rulemaking process, and the Forest Service needs to hear individualized feedback from us. Your response should be personal and tailored to you. Include experiences you've had in roadless areas if you've had them, and include facts, data, science, and sound reasoning. Use the talking points I've mentioned throughout this video to support your argument. My sources are in the description below if you want to use those. Talk about the ecological, economic, and recreational benefits that roadless areas provide. Make your case to the Forest Service and participate in this process. Comment period ends on Friday, September 19th. Now, you might be thinking, they're probably just going to ignore my comment and rescind the rule anyway, so why should I actually leave one? That's a good question, and it's entirely possible. They could go against overwhelming public sentiment and scientific reasoning and rescind the rule anyway. But even if they do, your comment is still helpful, because when this ends up in court, and it will end up in court, our comments can be used. The good ones, the well-argued, well-reasoned ones with lots of evidence and scientific reasoning, they can be used to say, hey, they ignored overwhelming public sentiment and scientific evidence and got rid of the rule anyway. And that can be used to help overturn the decision and save the roadless rule. Guys, y'all should know by now that I am a huge believer in the power of collective action. One voice might not be able to make a difference, but if we all stand up and use our voices at the same time, we absolutely can. We've already gotten over 78,000 comments on this thing. Let's add to that tally. Let's support the roadless rule and advocate for our last roadless forests. There's a link in the description to the comment page. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.